Okay. So today, first of all, thank you all for joining me. Today we're going to cover the Fabaceae family. This is our legume family. So we're going to be talking all about legumes today. And so I really want to focus in on this family because this is quite a large family, and one of the reasons that I wanted to do this talk because this is probably what we would say is the third largest plant family there is. So it's pretty much third only to the orchids and the asters. So the Orchidaceae family and the aster family are the ones that are larger than this family. So it's a pretty substantial family when you think about that. So has over 600 genera and over 20,000 species. Oftentimes we call this the pea family. And because this family actually has a lot of similar characteristics, normally a lot of these members have compound leaves. Usually it's a pinnately compound. But there is one plant we'll talk about today that has a palmate shaped leaf. And then others that have kind of more of this trifoliate leaf that has leaflets on it. Um, the flowers themselves, very characteristic. You can pretty much identify if it's a member of the pea family just by the flowers that it has. So the flowers themselves are a very irregular shape. Typically, they're five petaled. Um, this whole family is very diverse, and so some of the different plants we're going to talk about today, it's quite a range from vines to herbaceous plants to even trees. A lot of times we may overlook the legume family having a lot of tree species. A lot of times we kind of think of this more as different kinds of vegetables that we grow and eat, but it really is far more expansive than that. These can be found worldwide. We'll talk about even some native species today, as well as some invasive species, unfortunately. But kind of beyond the characteristic leaf and flower shape, many members of this family are what we call nitrogen fixers. But I'll say first, many of them are, not all of them are. I think a lot of people kind of get mistaken in thinking that every single member of this family is a nitrogen fixer when that is actually not the case. Only certain ones are. But basically, what is nitrogen fixing? So to kind of give you, a summarized version, um, a lot of the roots of this plant family have these nodules on them. And these nodules are actually created by bacteria. And so what's happening is it's kind of this like mutual relationship a little bit where the plants are supplying the bacteria with the different nutrients and energy that they need to survive. And actually, in return, then the bacteria is able to convert what we call atmospheric nitrogen into nitrates. Um, and so when that happens, it's almost like bacteria or the plants are kind of giving back um, these nitrates in the soil. And so oftentimes we kind of think of legumes, especially our nitrogen fixing legumes, as being what we call givers versus feeders, especially in the vegetable world. They actually give back nutrients instead of taking it away, so to speak. And so they can be very important, especially whenever we think of crop rotation and we have something that we call like a heavy feeder like corn, for example. And then the next year we may replace corn with something like soybeans just to help replenish the soil. And so, that's a large aspect of that concept of crop rotation and just a pretty well a common practice used, especially in more organic gardening techniques, but even used in conventional agriculture as well. So nitrogen fixers can be a big bonus to your garden. A couple other things. Not only are the flowers and the leaves, very easy to identify, but the fruit is as well. Especially as it matures and dries up, it releases these seeds. So the seeds are found in these pods that kind of break open in between two seams. And so it can be really fun to kind of, split our beans or our pea pods, and, you really can't miss it. Some species of the legume family have really seriously huge seed pods, so they can be pretty expansive. Also, a little bit irritating in the landscape too to clean up, and we'll talk about some examples of that as well. But kind of most importantly, why we're also covering the legume family is just how crucial this family is really to humans, to human populations, but of course our ecosystems, our wildlife as well. I mean, this is an important food source. There's a lot of agriculture crops that we're going to talk about today that are really essential and are big components of our diets, um, as well as some of the products that these plants produce. They can be different oils, um, even milks, different, some of their byproducts are used for different things, fibrous material. Sometimes even the raw material can be used in plastic production and even in paints and adhesives. So we'll kind of get into that a little bit. So this is a very important family that humans quite honestly rely on, that we need to have in order to survive. So, very crucial for that. So with that, let's kind of move into some examples. And so what I like to do with these presentations, I really always like to kind of give a diverse group. So even though we're talking about a lot of agriculture crops, we're also going to focus on some ornamentals as well. First one we're going to talk about is an agricultural crop, and that is chickpea. Now, of course, this is not really one that we are growing here, of course, in Kentucky, but just worldwide, this is an important food crop, especially when we think of places like India and Africa and even into Central and South America. A lot of you all may know chickpea from another name called garbanzo beans, as well as kind of another title for it. But primarily, this plant is grown for its nutritious seeds that can be used in a ton of different things, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. The food crop itself is a very standard, typical looking legume crop, bushy, pinnately compound foliage. The flowers you can kind of see on the picture here. Depending on the species, the cultivar that you have, the flower colors may differ from kind of more of a white, lilac, violet, even pinky color. Typically, the two chickpeas that are eaten, there's two different types, the desi and the kabuli. The desi is more kind of these dark angular seeds that have more of a blue violet flowers, whereas the kabuli is larger and lighter colored with white flowers. If you kind of look at their seed pods, you can kind of see a little bit in this picture. They're very hairy, and so you'll actually notice that on a lot of legume crops that they can have very fuzzy, hairy seed pods. So they're kind of fun to look at and to touch. Now, what are some of the benefits of consuming chickpea? So first off, I'll say a lot of us are probably consuming chickpeas. Maybe we are using chickpeas in something like hummus. Hummus is a really healthy, high protein, kind of vegetarian option for food. I myself love hummus and eat it pretty regularly. So if you're eating a lot of chickpeas, or you might just be eating the seeds themselves, mixing it in a salad type option, it's very high in fiber, very high in protein, and also a good source of iron and folic acid and phosphorus. Um, Even too, I don't know how much research has really been done on it, but in some of these cultures, they may have used chickpea as kind of more medicinally. Maybe some of the fluids that are kind of produced from the stems and leaves, even the seed pods themselves, might be used to treat things like potentially bronchitis. Again, I don't know exactly the science behind that, but it has been used for medicinal purposes in the past. So switching gears from an ag crop to kind of more of an ornamental and for that matter, a native plant species and definitely, a fan favorite. I mean, I don't know who doesn't love a good red bud. So let's talk about Eastern red buds. So this is one of our native kind of more understory trees that are found in a lot of our woodlands. Of course, if you live here in Kentucky, you're going to find them kind of growing alongside the highways, kind of on the edges of fields. And you'll easily be able to recognize that it's a red bud because the foliage kind of in this top picture here is more of a cordate leaf or kind of more of a heart shape leaf shape. And depending on so there are cultivated varieties of red bud. Um, of course, you can have more mature green leaves, but there are cultivars out there that kind of have more of this purpley, burgundy, even bronzy leaf coloration to it. But in addition to the leaves, if you see how the leaves are attached and you kind of see the branches, they're almost like this zigzag. So that can kind of help you with identifying it as well. And then, of course, in the early spring, these just really come alive before the leaves even come out. Beautiful pinkish purple flowers. And again, I mean, you have our native species, but you do have some cultivated varieties that have kind of maybe more of a shocking pink color to them. Um, but if you kind of look at each individual flower, you can kind of see it does resemble that little pea-shaped flower. And this is a really good early nectar source for a lot of our pollinator species, especially some of our early butterflies that are first to come out of their pupa. Um, Interesting thing as well, kind of, a lot of this family is edible. The flowers are also edible. You can eat them in salads, or you can eat them fried. Or I have a wonderful volunteer who gives me red bud jelly every year. So red bud jelly is definitely delicious. If you want to add that to your toast as well. Um, After the flowers are finished, it will give way to kind of these flat seed pods that can really hang on these trees for quite a while if it's not consumed by wildlife. So a lot of our songbirds and even things like bobwhite quails, kind of more into the eastern U.S., really adore eating this plant. So again, really good um, wildlife food source, nectar source um, for our animal populations. And then even more so than that, you can kind of see here, this is a good larval food source for um, 12 different lepidopteran species, so moth and butterfly species, where the caterpillar relies on this as a food source. And so if you can plant more of these in your landscape, or at least preserve the ones that are growing around there, then that really helps to benefit wildlife. Um, and also kind of interesting too, this is another plant where it may have had medicinal purposes at one time. Native Americans used this at one point. They used the bark itself to actually kind of make this kind of tea substance, and um, may have used it for kind of respiratory ailments. So I don't know, it's just very interesting kind of when you look at the ethnobotanical purposes of these plants. All right. I'm sure all of us know the common bean. I feel like I have to, this is the legume family. We got to talk about the common bean or common green bean, right? Um, and so with this species of green bean, um, it's kind of like what we talked about with the Brassicaceae family. It's like this one plant species um, that's been cultivated so many times that there's a ton of different beans that are coming from this one bean species. I mean, that's used for different cooking practices. So really, this is kind of a broad plant. Um, Originally, this comes from Central South America. Of course, it's grown for its edible seeds. Reason when you want to be growing it is because it is rich in protein, iron, thiamine, riboflavin, just a lot of benefits, just like chickpeas. Now, of course, for a lot of us, we kind of identify, especially our common green beans, into different gardening types. And there's far more different types than bush and pole, but those are just examples. We also have some runner beans as well. But we think of bush beans kind of more of a bushy bean cultivar or a pole bean that you're going to be, trellising or using for support. Um, as it climbs up there. And when you look at this plant, this is what we consider, especially in Kentucky, an annual herbaceous plant, an annual vegetable that we grow every year. You can identify it from its foliage. So you can kind of see in the picture, it has three leaflets. Um, and it will produce kind of more of a pea-shaped flower. Now, depending on the cultivar, you can have those flowers differ in coloration from yellow, white, pink, or red. A lot of the common green beans we're growing usually have a white or pinkish tint to the flower. And of course, depending on the cultivated variety you get, the type of bean that you get, the pods may differ in the coloration. Like here, we've got just kind of a normal, green bean, whereas you can get yellow, purple, or striped beans as well. And these are a good garden vegetable because these are indeed nitrogen fixers. And so if you wanted to practice crop rotation, you could do that. So say 1 year in your one garden spot, you're growing tomatoes, which are heavy feeders. The next year, instead of planting tomatoes, you may want to plant a garden bean where it can release nitrogen back into the soil to help replenish the soil um, instead of having to basically constantly fertilize or use a synthetic fertilizer. So, good option there. Of course, a lot of us love eating green beans, different beans, as just kind of normal part of our diets. And so it's kind of switching gears from our common green bean. Let's talk about a tree species. Let's talk about the Kentucky coffee tree. So this is one of our native trees. This is a very tall, large tree species. It can get anywhere up to 80 feet tall. Uh, if you look at the plant closely, it has those pinnately compound leaves. Now, what's interesting about the coffee tree is that it's kind of a late leaf producer. The leaves don't really emerge until kind of later spring, so it almost kind of looks a little bit naked when the leaves of other trees are already out and growing. And then not only that, but the leaves on coffee trees tend to drop earlier than other trees. And so it almost looks like this plant may be dead over half of the year. And so you might think, what's wrong with this tree? But really, nothing's wrong with it. This is just kind of a normal part of its life cycle, honestly. It just doesn't hold on to its leaves as much as other trees do. And kind of speaking of the leaves, depending on the mature stage of the leaf, it's going to vary in the coloration. So as it emerges, it's kind of more of this pinky reddish bronze color. And then as it matures and gets older, it becomes more of that kind of standard bluish green coloration. And then, of course, it'll also have some color change in the fall as well. So with this plant, we have male trees and we have female trees. And so actually a lot of members of this plant family are like that. Um, Most of the time, um, if you want to use this as a landscape plant, you're going to want to try to find a male, and hopefully if you're getting this from a nursery, they have the breakdown on if it's a male tree or a female tree. They may not. You know, unfortunately, it may not always be labeled properly. But the reason why you want a male tree is because it will not produce seed pods. And with this Kentucky coffee tree, when it produces seed pods, it is messy. And so it can be kind of a bear to clean up. Like say you have this in your landscape, just cleaning it out of your garden beds or cleaning it out of your lawn when you're trying to mow, or if it's near a structure or a driveway, trying to clean that up can be, you know, a lot of people consider it to be a pain. Um, but on the flip side of that, you know, if you're getting a male plant, it's really not as showy. So with a female, it actually produces these really pretty whitish colored flowers on the branch tips later in the spring and early summer. Um, and so that can be, you know, appealing to people. And then those flowers will give way to those seed pods. So it's kind of really up to you how you want to approach it. Um, it's really interesting because a lot of times we may be like not wanting to recommend it as a landscape plant, especially for small yards, but at the same time, um, this is a very adaptable plant. This is a very good, kind of easier going, tolerates a lot of different soil types, especially if you've got, unfortunately, crappy soil where topsoil has been removed. It does well in full light, full sun conditions. It actually does relatively well kind of in more urban environments or settings where maybe the soil is compacted. Um, at the college I went to in Pennsylvania, we had tons of Kentucky coffee trees that were kind of lining our parking lot area of our science building. And they fared very well, even in those little tiny green spaces where they really don't have a lot of room and you've got, you know, parking all around you. Now, on the flip side, though, they were female trees and we got a lot of seed pods every year. But you know, again, all around though, it's a really good tree. That it's especially if you have a little bit more land that you can kind of place it somewhere where maybe its seed pods won't bother you too much. You can do that. Um, Before I kind of move on from the coffee tree, again, we kind of get into more ethnobotanical aspects of these plants. And so um, apparently, Native Americans also used this plant where they would actually ground the seeds and brew them almost like into a coffee type beverage. However, this doesn't contain caffeine, but they used it kind of as a coffee like beverage, a hot kind of energy beverage. So, you know, it's just very interesting to see how these plants were used especially with our indigenous cultures. All right, so I go from a native plant to a to an invasive plant, and I feel like I have to talk about this plant belonging to this family and just the negative impact it is that has that it's caused on our ecosystems. So I'm talking about kudzu, unfortunately. And so kudzu is this woody perennial vine. It's deciduous. It originally comes from Asia. It was introduced into the US back in the 1800s. Primarily, it was used for erosion control as, you know, our community expanded, farming community, agriculture, urbanization started expanding. When they were clearing out areas, especially of our woodlands, they needed something for erosion control. And they saw that kudzu was a great, fast growing plant that could kind of take over those areas. And so little did they know how much of a detriment it would actually be hundreds of years later. But in addition to erosion control, it was also considered a good forage for different livestock as well. And so they used it for multiple purposes. Um, so even though this plant kind of prefers moist soils and full sun, it can grow pretty well about anywhere. It does well on a lot of disturbed sites. It grows on a lot of fields, near pastures, roadsides. And so what this plant does is it kills off the natural vegetation by basically shading it out. I mean, you all see the pictures where it just completely blankets trees and shrubs, almost like a carpet. Um, this is able to reproduce vegetatively through stolons, and so that doesn't help. That makes it very much more of an aggressive grower. So it's definitely a problem. It kind of has these, as you can see in the picture, these kind of flexible, bendy stems. Um, which kind of interestingly um, maybe serve a good purpose if you ever try to weave a basket, like a natural basket. Great for weaving baskets, but not really something that you want to be growing for that purpose, of course. But whenever you look at these stems, you can see it has more of that compound leaf shape with the trifoliate leaflets. So it's very easy to identify. What's interesting are the flowers. The flowers are actually quite beautiful. It produces these flower stalks of these pinky purple flowers. And I remember whenever I was younger, and I saw the flowers. At first, I didn't initially in my brain figure out that that was coming from the kudzu, and it's like, wait, that's the kudzu producing these flowers because it was just so vibrant, and so it's quite sad that it's such an invasive, detrimental plant because it does produce quite beautiful flowers. And even the seed pods, kind of the flattened seed pods are really fun to look at too, because they're kind of more of those hairy ones. But regardless of all that, this is a serious threat, especially in the southern US. It has just completely taken over and continues to do so. And so you want to have management practices in place to try to remove it from landscapes. And even if there were if you see it around here in your landscape, removing it. um, Definitely removal is crucial. um, and I'll kind of say this, I don't know, sometimes even though you see the pictures of how expansive it is, some people don't even recognize that that's kudzu or that it's such a problem. It kind of blows my mind a little bit about how little people know, to the point where I'll kind of tell you a quick story where I had a client come to me talking about wanting to grow kudzu. This person wanted to grow kudzu in their garden beds because they had heard about the good medicinal properties of it, apparently, that they wanted to actually use it in their green smoothies. And it was just like, whoa, what? It's like, no, no, I cannot ever recommend this as a landscape plant. I don't know exactly, what all its medicinal properties are, but even so, this is one that we want to get rid of. We don't want to promote this in any way. We don't want people to be trying to grow this for any purpose, really. And for that matter, even if you see this on the side of the road, I definitely wouldn't recommend, taking pieces off of it, or if you're going to use it for medicinal purposes, just because you don't know where it's been. You don't know if you've had different types of, pesticide sprayed on it. You don't know what kind of microorganisms could be on it. And so just in general, you just don't want to use it, period. So just saying, um, please avoid kudzu at all costs. Don't use it for your green smoothies, and definitely don't try to grow it for that purpose. So I'll kind of move on from that. All right. So let's move on to another native tree species, and that's the honey locust. And so we have black locust, we have honey locust. Um, Black locust is kind of more, even though it's kind of found in the US, it's kind of naturalized and invaded other places where it's almost become more of an invasive species. Honey locust, although not quite as bad as black locust, can be an invader. Again, I hate to kind of for something that's a native species, I really hate to say like it's invasive, but it is aggressive and it can spread into places that you don't want it to. So just kind of be mindful of that. These can be quite tall trees, again, up to 80 feet or more in feet. And so this is also one that can tolerate a range of soil conditions, moisture conditions. It's going to fare pretty well. Um, Maybe not quite one that I would consider as much of an urban type tree as the Kentucky coffee tree, but one that we generally see growing in a variety of conditions. So it has that typical compound foliage. It's often very small, even kind of more. You almost get like this kind of double pinnately compound foliage. It's often very feathery in appearance. Um, Really, how you're going to kind of identify it, besides the compound foliage, is you'll probably notice a different aspect of it where the trunks and branches have thorns. And let me say, they can have some big thorns. You can get like a good solid, like 3-inch thorn on these guys. So it can be a tad painful. And so, kind of for the reasons of it having thorns, being able to spread aggressively, not one I would generally recommend as a landscape plant. You may have some on your property, you might have a field or somewhere that you could probably put these, or maybe they're already there, but generally not one that I would recommend for landscaping. Now, with that said, there are exceptions where we do have some newer cultivated varieties out there on the market that may be thornless, even some that don't produce pods either, kind of more of a sterile cultivar, if you will, because that is the other downside is this will produce seed pods that can be, messy in the landscape to have to rake up. One good cultivar that's out there is called Sunburst, and it has a very sweet fragrance to it, so it can be a little bit more appealing in that regard. But kind of aside from, again, this is a native tree, it's very beneficial for multiple purposes. So let's kind of push aside the negatives of it for a second. And let's talk about all the positives that it really does for our biodiversity, our different wildlife populations. And so the seed pod that it produces, the pulp that's inside, is actually very attractive and a good food source for our insect populations and our small mammals, bees, butterflies, moths, small mammals, kind of more even small rodent type mammals are really going to use this as a good source. And I think people have sometimes, used it as well, although I can't say I've ever tried it. Um, but apparently, it's very sweet, and actually, the pod itself, um, when it starts to turn black, it often kind of creates this sweet tasting sticky substance on it, which is hence where it gets its name of honey locust, because that sticky substance, that that sweet tasting, kind of reminds you of honey a little bit. Um, but with the stickiness, of course, if it, drops on the ground, then, you get a little bit of a mess. But if you ever look at the seed ponds, they're quite pretty. They're kind of more this twisted shape to it. So kind of a little bit more unique. And then one other thing I'll mention about this is not only is it serving a good food source for just kind of adult animal populations, insect populations, but it's good for larvae as well. It's a good larval host plant for some of our different lepidopteran species. So, for instance, this serves as a host plant for the caterpillar, the silver-spotted skipper. Silver-spotted skippers are quite frequent visitors to a lot of our gardens, our landscape flowers, especially zinnias. I see them all the time on our zinnias hopping around. So, yeah. So again, even if it's not the nicest landscape tree, still serves a lot of good purposes. All right. Let's kind of switch gears from trees and crops to let's talk about an ornamental, a really good flowering ornamental, and that is lupine. And so a lot of us might enjoy growing lupine, depending on the species you have. Some are a little bit better for the landscape than others. Generally, lupine like kind of more cooler climates, but um, some cultivars will do fine here in Kentucky as an ornamental. A lot of these are native actually to the U.S., kind of more western U.S., more west of the Mississippi region. Um, but lupine is kind of underrated when it comes to how beneficial it can be for insect populations. Of course, the flowers that it produces these beautiful stalks of pea-shaped flowers that are attractive to pollinators as a nectar source, but then also this serves as a good host plant for different butterfly species, different caterpillar species. So it's kind of underrated in that regard. Um, but as you're growing it, you're probably getting these little clumps of these palmate shaped leaves. So you can kind of see on this upper picture here, it differs a little bit from other species of the legume family. And then this will give rise to these beautiful stalks of flowers, generally are blooming kind of late spring into early summer. A lot of the native lupines are kind of more blues and violets and whites, but you get some cultivars out there that are almost like hot pinks or almost red, deep red colors, so you can get a good mix there. Um, these will produce a seed pod. You can kind of see here kind of the more of these little flattened, hairy seed pods. But really, not really serving much of a purpose when in terms of food crop. This is grown strictly as an ornamental plant, especially for our landscapes. All right. So let's move on to, we talked about garden beans. Let's talk about the pea, because this is the pea family. So let's look at our standard pea. Every time I think of a pea plant, I still think of the studies that Gregor Mendel did on the pea plants in his garden that helped lead the way in just genetics in general. And so every time I look at a pea plant, I just always think of Mendel. So I don't know if anyone else thinks about that, but I do. Um, so peas are originally native to Eurasia, so different parts, Europe, Asian continents. We grow them here as a cool season vegetable. We treat it as an annual. These are going to grow, of course, when we think cool season vegetable in cooler temperatures. Generally, this plant, in Kentucky, as we start to get temperatures in the 80s, it really starts to kind of grow. It stops to grow and kind of fizzle out a little bit. And so generally, we're growing this kind of more in our early spring months. Um, but when we are growing it, it does well in full sun. It likes moist but well-drained soil. Of course, we are caging this or trellising it in some way because it grows with tendrils. So not only does it have the compound leaves, but it has those tendrils to help it, cling on to different surfaces. The flowers, depending on the cultivar, can vary from pink, white, purple generally. Again, we think of Mendel's studies on the different colors of the flowers. So, I always look back at that. Um, this is kind of like the garden bean where you've had quite a bit of cultivation from this one species. So you can get a ton of different varieties of peas from that. And so really the seed pods themselves are going to differ just depending on what that cultivated variety is. So the seed pods could be kind of more fibrous or hairy than others. The seeds inside them might be more wrinkled or smooth. And then, of course, the colors are going to kind of vary all around. Of course, we use this as a major food crop. We may eat these raw or we can fry them, we can cook them. Um, just kind of, again, depending on the type that we're growing. These are also very much a good nitrogen fixer as well. And so again, good when we talk about standard crop rotation. So it can be very beneficial with giving back that nitrogen into the soil. So good overall kind of standard garden plant for that. All right, I've got two more to talk about, and both of them are kind of more ag-based plants. Let's talk about the peanuts. So of course, when we think of the pea family, we think of peas and beans, but we may also think of peanuts. This is a legume as well. This is native to South America, specifically in central Brazil. It's grown worldwide. However, generally this is not a very frost hardy plant, and it prefers to have longer summers. So I actually know a few people that have grown peanuts here in our part of Western Kentucky. But I will say generally this is going to be a plant that I wouldn't really grow it as a crop unless it's like in a zone 8 or above, and we're in a zone 7. It really just kind of depends on when our frost dates are. And if we kind of have, you know, frost kind of come later in the fall, we might be able to get a crop out of this. It just really depends on when it happens. So you may have some success trying to grow it here, but you may not as well. Just kind of depends on how our growing season is. But if you are growing it or trying to grow it, it also has the little leaflets. They have this prominent mid vein, kind of lighter colored mid vein you can see in those top pictures. Really cool thing about peanuts, which you kind of guess, because it's like, well, it's really not producing its pod on the above ground. What's going on when we grow peanuts? The peanuts are actually below ground. So this is actually a phenomenon called geocarpy. And what geocarpy is whenever it's producing those yellow flowers that you can kind of see there, Once those flowers are fertilized, um, they actually begin to grow down into the soil where there's kind of, it produces kind of the fertilized ovary, if you will, the fertilized ovary that will give way to the seed pod develops underground. And so eventually it produces that kind of weird shaped peanut um, that we identify so much with. Um, so kind of very, very neat in that regard. And so when we're growing the peanut, when we're using the peanut, once we harvest it, it can be used for a lot of different purposes. So people can eat it raw or cooked. You can make it into different peanut oils. You can grind it into a type of peanut flour, or you can just eat it just like we do with other our nut species. And it's just a good healthy snack, unless we smother it, of course, in too much oil or salt. Then it may not be quite as healthy, but really delicious roasted. Reason we may want it is it's very high in proteins and other minerals and vitamins. Um, and again, kind of a good vegetarian source of protein, especially if not a lot of meat is being consumed. And so it's really good for that regard. Um, all right. So I'll get kind of the questions into the chat here in a minute. But let's talk about soybeans. Let's finish up our talk with soybeans, because this is probably one of the most important crops, agricultural crops that we are growing with this plant family. It's not native to the US, it's native to Asia, but we grow it as an annual crop here in Kentucky. Oftentimes we will rotate it with corn in our agricultural fields. What are we using it for? We're using it for different purposes, um, where we are um, using it as a protein for not only livestock food production, but for human food production as well. Humans use this quite a bit in their diets. So, especially anyone who maybe is lactose intolerant or can't have dairy, especially we think of a lot of people in Kentucky right now that are plagued with alpha-gal, where they may not be able to consume dairy. You have alternative sources such as soy and soy milk and soy products that are a good substitute for dairy. And so that's substantial. And then just in a lot of different cultures around the world, they will use tofu. So they'll use tofu, kind of more fermented bean paste, in a lot of recipes as well. And so it's just very important for that. Also, you may think of edamame, which are kind of more of our younger soybeans, which can be steamed or cooked or boiled. Um, so, I mean, it really serves a lot of purposes when it comes to food production. So it's very important. When it comes to the plant itself, of course, I'm sure everyone can probably identify it in the field, because if it's not corn you're seeing in the field, you're probably seeing soybean, or of course you could be seeing wheat or, alfalfa or things of that nature, but you're probably seeing soybeans. So it kind of has more of an erect branching habit. You know, we think about determinate versus indeterminate varieties. That's the same when we think about tomatoes, whether it has kind of a set growth point and kind of stops growing at that level, or if it will just kind of continually grow for the rest of its life cycle. Um, Generally, these are not planted until after danger of frost has passed in Kentucky. And so they will continue to grow during the growing season. It does produce kind of these whitish, purplish colored flowers, and that will give way to different seed pods depending on the cultivated variety of soybean that you're growing. In those seed pods, depending on the type that you're growing, can be anywhere from 1 to 4 seeds per pod. Generally, honestly, I see a lot of cultivated varieties that have 3 seeds per pod for the most part, it seems. Um, Whenever farmers are growing this for ag production, a lot of times they are going to wait to harvest, of course, not only until those pea pods, those bean pods mature, obviously, but also when the leaves start to decline and even to the point where they fall off the plant. And generally, when the moisture content overall of the plant has dropped significantly, studies anywhere from about like 13% of moisture content. And so that's kind of how they gauge when to harvest the soybeans in their fields. And of course, depending on what the soybeans may be used for, they may be harvesting at different times as well, just kind of dependent on what they're using the crop for or who they are selling it to, basically. Um, some other things I'll mention with soybeans, not only is it a good food crop, but a lot of times we will use the oil for different things as well. The oil is essential and even used in fertilizer. It's good. Um, it's often used in paints, adhesives, so different kinds of materials used in construction projects or household projects. So again, it's serving multiple purposes there. So very, very important ag product. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I've got like a few minutes here. So um, got a question about eradicating kudzu. So yeah, kudzu is definitely it's a struggle. There, you know, a lot of times you might be whacking it back and probably, unfortunately, spraying with herbicides. Sometimes herbicides are really the only options to eradicate some of these invasive plants. So you may be spraying multiple rounds of different herbicides on it. Some people may bring in goats. That sounds crazy, but sometimes they may bring in some livestock animals that might, if they have this kind of in their own field or pasture, they may bring livestock in to kind of eat on it, if you will. So that might be another practice. But that, generally when trying to control it and eradicate it, usually you're whacking it back and you are applying a herbicide to try to kill it off. So, does anyone have any other questions before we'll wrap up for today? All right. Well, thank you all for joining me today. So I'm going to post the recording on YouTube this afternoon if anyone needs to reference back to it. But otherwise, I'm going to stop recording now.